Anybody that's read the Diary of Wimpy Kid books is familiar with Greg's closest friend, Rowley Jefferson, as he's made frequent appearances throughout the series and has been involved in many of the antics Greg runs into. Rowley serves as sort of an opposite to Greg. He's not obsessed with fame or looking good. He wants to do the right thing and be kind to everybody he meets. Rowley does have some things in common with Greg though, and has even tried to duplicate his diary thing in Project Rules, where he decided to get his own journal so he could write down his feelings and day-to-day events as a way to connect with his friend that does the same thing. Well, 11 years after that book, Jeff Kinney decided to take that idea and transform it into Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid, which is essentially Rowley's version of Diary of Wimpy Kid. The idea was also put in the Do-It-Yourself Wimpy Kid book, with only a few pages with colored illustrations and cursive writing being the biggest differences between it and the actual full-length book. It seems the series was going to be a yearly thing, much like its counterpart, with the first book releasing in 2019, then 2020, and the final entry releasing in 2021. I guess it was becoming too much to manage with Kinney's schedule, which included already having to work on the Wimpy Kid books, so it had to come to an end. And yes, Kinney is still making Wimpy Kid books, along with other things like Pop Tropica and worldwide tours. Anyways, while the idea seemed like a pretty reasonable way to expand the Wimpy Kid universe and give insight to Rowley's side of things, the series isn't all that it seems to those unfamiliar with it. So without further ado, let's give this Wimpy Kid spin-off a deep look and analyze what made it so odd and unlike its counterpart. So the overall idea of this series should be pretty obvious. Rowley gets his own journal and jots down his daily thoughts as a way to express himself and follow in the footsteps of his friend. But that's not exactly the case. We'll get into why that is later. First, let's dissect the entry that started it all and analyze how it separates itself from the OG series and just how good it is in general. The most obvious thing is this book is from Rowley's perspective, so the overall feel is more juvenile, but also more optimistic and carefree. He doesn't really analyze any situation as deeply as his best friend would, and he's never mean to anybody, or tries to initially wrong anybody. The art style is pretty different too. It's more crude than Greg's drawings, with rougher looking shapes, less detail, and no noses, a fact Greg brought up in an earlier book. As for the book itself, it's completely new stories told from the perspective of Rowley, with the flow and direction feeling similar, but not exact as Greg's writing style from his own series. There's also no solid narrative or conflict in this book. It seems to be weird random stories Rowley's experienced throughout his life and wants to write about. So overall, how is this book? It's not bad, it's certainly entertaining enough to hold any reader's attention, but I feel like the story's direction wasn't exactly the best. As I mentioned before, this book doesn't really have a tension to drive itself forward, just random stories, and even then, the stories don't have much of a shared trouble or enough of a conflict to really make them interesting. I'm just saying, one of the fundamentals of writing is that there needs to be a conflict or conflicts the character faces throughout the story that gets resolved at the end, and none of them really feel like they pay off. The Diary of Wimpy Kid books didn't have the deepest conflicts either, but most of them have Greg going through some kind of situation he deals with throughout the book, and it's settled by the end to wrap everything up. If the book was more akin to Greg's day-to-day writing, I think it would have been a lot better considering how that kind of writing helps to maintain some kind of flow, so that Rowley doesn't just dump everything at once into an entry. Speaking of Rowley's writing, he has these small notes in the book where he stops and explicitly tells the audience something exciting is going to happen, for some reason. I don't know why this is done, they feel forced and don't help with the book's flow. Another complaint I have is I feel a lot of this book is dedicated to Greg, and yes, I know that's his best friend, but still. I feel like a focus on some of the other stuff that Rowley does that doesn't involve Greg would have been more appropriate and interesting, considering there's probably stuff Rowley does that he doesn't bring up to his wimpy friend. Like, early in the book, Rowley writes about Greg's life, which includes a lot of information most fans already know about, so this doesn't really do anything for this book's quality. There's also a few other similar sections in this book, and they just feel so unnecessary for a book that's supposed to be about Rowley. I learned more about Greg in this book than I did with Rowley. It'd be cool to know if Rowley has other friends he regularly talks to, some of the classes he has to do without Greg, or remarkable memories he wants to bring up from vacation he took to another part of the world. It would have given the book more variety and helped separate it from the series it's based off of. Hey, getting back to Greg for a moment, he seems to be overly cruel in these books, and while that does feel off at first, I guess it does make sense. I know that Greg isn't the best kid around or a role model, but some of the stuff he does in this book is really demeaning to Rowley. I suppose this is how Greg is supposed to be perceived, since Rowley doesn't have any negative bias towards his best friend. And this book isn't written by Greg, so he can't be an unreliable narrator in this situation and regret how things happened. Anyways, I feel the stories feel a bit dragged out too. Some of them feel like they're including too many details that aren't really necessary to know. Like that whole library thing should have been cut short considering how lame some of it gets. Otherwise, I think this is a decent read for any fans of the Diary of Wimpy Kid series. It's interesting to see Rowley's side of things. The humor is more juvenile, but does fit in more of Rowley's tone. And overall, it felt good to have some sort of deviation from reading the Wimpy Kid books. If this book had more of a connected feel, it would have been a lot better, as the separate pieces really make the story feel all over the place and random. Okay, with the first book out of the way, we should have a solid idea as to what the rest of the series entails, right? It's a similar formula to the Wimpy Kid books, but it's from Rowley's perspective, so it's more childlike, naive, and more positive, as opposed to Greg's more pessimistic side of things. Well, no, not exactly. You see, the second book is pretty different from the first book, and completely different from the series it's based off of too, which, in my opinion, actually works well, but we'll get into that in a minute. Let's talk about what the second book entails. The second book, Rowley Jefferson's Awesome Friendly Adventure, is a made-up fantasy epic Rowley tells through the pages of his diary, with aspects of his life thrown in fairly often. It seems to take place around medieval times, has mythical creatures throughout, and Rowley and Greg serve as the story's main characters, as they go on an adventure to find Rowley's mom after she went missing one day. They run into multiple obstacles along the way, but are able to get through their troubles by being kind and understanding. So, despite the detour from the series' direction, I actually enjoyed this book more than its predecessor, and is the best out of the 3 entries. This book has an actual struggle Rowley and his companions deal with. A struggle that is also in line with his character, considering how much he cares for his parents, so my main issue from last time is absolutely gone. I wanted to keep reading to see how things would get resolved, and to see what kind of wacky things Rowley was going to write about. The characters do feel a little bit too LOL random, but to be fair, they all have their own personality that works with the adventure, and makes sense when the fact this is Rowley's imagination comes into consideration. Really, the only thing I didn't like about it was the real-life interjections Rowley sprinkled in throughout. I think they really take away from the adventure, don't really do much for the narrative, and break the immersion. I would have been okay with an interruption after Rowley was done telling the story in full. That way he can give a little bit of insight about it and get Greg's take on it, which would have caused some tension and opened room for some humor that sometimes comes from the boys' disagreements. Not to mention, the interjections all follow the same pattern. Greg presents an idea that would be very marketable, but not necessarily moral, and Rowley responds with a spin on the idea that's more in line with his morals and innocence. Then they fight over what should be done, and they sort of come to a compromise. Now, I will say, the arguments are fairly humorous, but it gets so repetitive that it starts to wear in this book's entertainment factor. In my opinion, the series should have kept going in this direction for at least a little bit. Get rid of the breakaways to the real world, and keep everything about the fantastical epic. And the books could have been decent, and had a story that's not exactly deep, but provides for some fun adventures to just sit back and read through. It also would have provided the reader some insight about Rowley's life too, as this entry has a couple metaphors for Rowley's encounters in the real world. It could have been a good break from the series it's based on by having a less down-to-earth approach to things, but still be appropriate with the Wimpy Kid series, with the way Rowley references his real life, and due to the humor spread throughout. Alright, let's get back to the rest of the books. We went from Rowley's take on Wimpy Kid, to an epic Rowley made to have fun and show off his creative side. So, what's next for this series? Anthological scary stories meant for children. Okay, listen. I know that the previous book felt like a weird direction to take the series in, but it at least felt in line with Rowley's personality, considering how uplifting the adventure is, and how a lot of the issues were resolved by being kind and understanding. It also made sense with his more naive and childlike attitude, considering how juvenile the story felt in its tone and mood. If anything, this book sort of goes against Rowley's personality, based on the fact Rowley's not a fan of horror at all. Rowley couldn't even watch Hello, You're Dead due to how terrifying it was to him, thought the kid's version of Spine Chillers, which is this book's version of the Goosebumps series, was way too scary, and was practically hyperventilating as he and Greg were writing the script and storyboarding the movie Night of the Nightcrawlers. So yeah, this feels a lot more out of left field than the previous book. With that being said, most of the stories aren't really meant to be scary or frightening. They just have supernatural things in them, with the stories using unworldly factors to create humor or silly situations. Speaking of which, there's also stories in this book that are clearly metaphors for some of the things Rowley's experienced in his life, such as cell phone usage, his friendship with Greg, and other things young boys go through. And it's nice to have these things because it brings it back a little to the fundamentals of the series. And just for the record, I know I complained about the first book having no central conflict to really drive the story along, but I'm not going to apply that logic here. This book contains anthological stories, so each is in their own little world. So as long as each of them has their own plot/conflict, they don't all have to have something in common. Okay, with all that out of the way, how was the book? It's okay. I don't really know what to say about this book because there's really not much to it. None of the stories are really that enthralling or interesting. They all end abruptly, and as I stated before, the whole thing is essentially a huge breakaway from the previous books and the series it's based off of. I guess Kinney was trying to come up with a new type of direction with each book, but in doing so, created more confusion as to the identity of the series. It made for a mediocre entry because none of the stories are particularly interesting or creative. If there is one saving grace for this book, it is funny. It actually has some good laughs while going through some of the stories, and I think that's mostly because they're just completely ridiculous stories, but still, I kinda like the humor in this book. So yeah, that's why the series is rather odd to me. It started off as Rowley's version of Greg's journal entries, but then became a way for Rowley to talk about his imagination and daydreams, then his own original spooky stories. I will say, there is a central theme about all of them, and that is, Rowley talks about his life in one way or another, with the first book being blatant retellings of his experiences, and the other two entries having mostly small metaphors spread throughout. Otherwise, the books are surprisingly all different from each other, and there's only so much to really link them together and make them feel like a solid series. As I mentioned before, the series ended in 2021, with Spooky Stories being the last entry, and I can't help but think what would have happened if it kept going. What kind of other things would Rowley have written about, and would have it been possible for other characters to get their own books from their perspective? As I was doing research for this video, I ran into an AMA Jeff Kinney did a couple years back. I found a comment where he stated Rowley went on to become happy and successful, so maybe future books could have had certain ideas Rowley tried out that would later lead to his success. Getting past that, I know I said earlier that Kinney canceled the series because of how busy he was with other works including Wimpy Kid, but I'm pretty sure he also gave it up because of how inconsistent it was and not wanting to continue something that felt very random. How different were each of the books going to be before things were too much to handle and felt too far removed from the Wimpy Kid series? Anyways, while I was doing research for this video, I decided to go to the Loaded Diaper subreddit to see people's opinion on the series, and while most of them seem to like the first book, or at least don't strongly dislike it, the community seems to be mixed about the other two entries. Some contest the Adventure book to be the worst, with its totally nonsensical nature and repetitive interjections with Greg and Rowley in the real world, and others contend Spooky Stories is the worst due to how forgettable it is and its lackluster narratives. Speaking of the community's complaints, some fans also seem to be irritated by the fact Rowley randomly capitalizes words that really don't need to be emphasized, and the overuse of silhouettes in the illustrations, as in there's drawings where characters are in the foreground but they aren't detailed like they should be. The reason I bring these up is I've seen people talk about these two things when discussing the more recent Wimpy Kid books, so it seems Kinney transfers some of the issues from the Wimpy Kid series into this one. They were also fairly common grievances that I didn't bring up in my previous Wimpy Kid video because I never really noticed them until people pointed it out to me, so yeah, just more fuel to that video's fire. Just thought I'd bring those up because I like reading about the discourse about the topics my videos are about, and it's always nice to add more perspective to these conversations too. I know I mentioned this in the last Wimpy Kid video, but some of the drawings from these books make for some absolutely great out of context images. For those that haven't read the books, let me know what you think each of these illustrations is alluding to in the comments. Okay, there's two more things I wanted to mention before I end this video. Since the aforementioned books are more focused on Rowley, I just want to mention there's a Wimpy Kid book that has Roderick as the main highlight. It's called Diaper Overload, and I think it's one of the better recent books. Now, the whole thing is written by Greg, but a lot of the stories told throughout are about Roderick and his bandmates. So, if you're not too familiar with the Wimpy Kid series and want to read something that largely follows Greg's older brother, I would recommend it. Secondly, people on the Loaded Diaper subreddit have also made their own Wimpy Kid-like stories that take place from perspective of the series characters. So, if you're curious about such an idea, go check it out. Alright, that's all I wanted to say about Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid. Have a good day, and let me know what you think about each book if you've read them before. I like to hear what all kinds of fans of Wimpy Kid have to say.